This revenge story contains intense acts of retribution that may be excessive and could be disturbing to some viewers.
It all began with a conversation that felt ordinary at first, but quickly turned into something far darker. Tom, my childhood friend, leaned forward and said, "Wes, today I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone before." His voice trembled slightly, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening. What followed wasn't just a story, it was the beginning of my descent into chaos. Tom recounted an incident during his company's retreat at night filled with drinking, laughter, and camaraderie. He had been seated directly across from George, his boss. At first, everything seemed normal. The drinks flowed freely, and George's booming laugh echoed through the banquet hall. But then things took a sinister turn. As the alcohol loosened tongues, George made a comment that stopped Tom cold. "Hey, how much do you make? Half of what I earn, right? So, tell me, do you have a mistress yet?" That question spiraled into something far more insidious. When Tom hesitated, George smirked and admitted, almost casually, that he himself had multiple affairs with women who came onto him willingly, or so he claimed. One name stuck out among the rest, Kelly, Tom's wife. I remember sitting there, stunned. My mind raced as Tom continued. He described how George taunted him further, making crude jokes about relationships and infidelity. For Tom, it was too much. In a fit of rage, he stood up and punched George square in the face. The room erupted in chaos, plates clattered to the floor, guests gasped, and George stumbled backward, blood streaming from his nose. Afterward, Tom stormed out of the banquet hall, leaving behind a scene of shock and confusion. He spent the night at a nearby internet cafe, avoiding contact with anyone from the retreat. When he returned to work days later, he found that nothing had changed. George acted as though nothing had happened, treating Tom with the same casual indifference as always. It was as if the entire incident had been swept under the rug. But for Tom, it wasn't over. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was deeply wrong. That's when he decided to confront his wife. Sitting her down one evening, he asked point blank, "Are you having an affair?" She broke down in tears, unable to deny it. Hearing this, I felt a chill run down my spine. Could the same thing be happening to me? Was Kathryn involved with someone else? The thought gnawed at me relentlessly. As Tom finished his story, I tried to process everything. His wife's betrayal, his anger, his pain, it all felt uncomfortably close to home. I realized I needed answers. If my wife Kathryn was hiding something, I would find out. No matter what it took. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Images of Tom's distraught face kept replaying in my mind. I thought about Kathryn, the woman I loved, the life we built together, and wondered if it was all a lie. I found myself torn between two conflicting thoughts. There's no way Kathryn would cheat, and what if she actually did? The next morning, I hired a private investigator. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. My mind was consumed by one thing: uncovering the truth about Kathryn. For weeks, I waited anxiously as the investigator dug into her activities. He followed her movements, tracked her phone calls, and monitored her late-night outings. Each day felt like an eternity, but finally, the report arrived. When I opened the envelope, my stomach churned. The evidence was damning. Kathryn wasn't just having an affair, she was meeting 3 men regularly at a private rental space tucked away in the mountains. These weren't consensual encounters. They were coerced, born out of fear and manipulation. According to the report, the first incident occurred over a year ago when Greg, her boss, cornered her late one night at the office. She resisted, but he overpowered her. To ensure her silence, he filmed the entire incident. From that point on, she became their puppet, forced to meet them whenever they demanded. The investigator included timestamps, photos, and detailed notes about each encounter. One entry stood out. Subject met with 3 individuals at a remote location. Interaction appeared non-consensual. Subject showed visible distress during departure. Another note read, repeated pattern observed. Subject appears trapped in this dynamic due to fear of exposure or retaliation. I stared at the pages, my hands trembling. How could this have happened? How could she let this happen? And why hadn't she told me? Anger bubbled inside me, but beneath it lay a deep sadness, sense of loss for the life we once shared. That night, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the wall. Images of Kathryn's face kept flashing in my mind. Her laughter, her smile, her gentle touch, they all felt like lies now. But I couldn't stop here. I needed irrefutable proof. Something tangible that would leave no room for denial. The night was cold and eerily silent as I drove up the winding mountain road. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white from tension. The headlights cut through the dense forest, illuminating twisted branches that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. I had one goal in mind: to capture irrefutable proof of what was happening at the private rental space where Kathryn met those men. When I arrived, I parked my car a safe distance away, ensuring it wouldn't be noticed by anyone entering or leaving the premises. The area was shrouded in darkness, save for the dim glow of lanterns scattered around the parking lot. A sign near the entrance advertised hourly rates, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., unlimited stay for $50. Below it, smaller text promised privacy. All spaces enclosed with blue tarps. I spotted Kathryn's car almost immediately. It was parked in the far left corner, partially obscured by shadows. Through the gaps in the tarp surrounding her designated space, I could see faint movements inside. My heart pounded as I crept closer, careful not to make a sound. I positioned myself behind a nearby tree, ensuring I had a clear view without being seen. Then I turned on the camera and began recording. What I saw next shattered whatever remained of my trust in Kathryn. Inside the makeshift enclosure, she sat silently as the 3 men took turns speaking to her. Their voices were muffled, but their body language spoke volumes. Greg, the ringleader, was clearly in charge, barking orders while the others nodded obediently. Kathryn flinched every time he raised his voice, her posture shrinking further into herself. At one point, Greg handed her a small device. She hesitated before accepting it, her hands visibly shaking. Whatever it was, it seemed important. Later, I would learn it was a recording device containing incriminating footage of their previous encounters. They were using it to keep her compliant, ensuring she wouldn't dare speak out against them. As the hours passed, the situation grew increasingly unbearable to watch. At one stage, Greg grabbed Kathryn roughly by the arm and pulled her toward him. She cried out softly, but no one intervened. The other 2 men simply looked away, as if this kind of behavior was routine. By the time they finished, my head was spinning. I stopped recording and retreated to my car, clutching the camera tightly. Once inside, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. What I had witnessed wasn't just betrayal, it was abuse, pure and simple. On the drive home, I replayed the events in my mind, trying to process everything. I wanted to confront Kathryn immediately, to demand answers and explanations. But another part, the rational part, knew I needed to proceed carefully. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about justice. The drive back home felt longer than usual. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, and a deep sense of loss. The footage I had captured weighed heavily on me, not just as proof, but as a testament to how far things had fallen apart. Kathryn's face in those videos haunted me. She wasn't just a victim anymore. Her silence made her complicit. And now, it was time for answers. When I walked through the door, she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. Her expression shifted instantly when she saw me. "You're home early," she said. trying to sound casual. But there was something off about her tony and nervous edge that betrayed her calm facade. Yeah, I replied coldly, setting the bag containing the camera and other evidence on the table. We need to talk. She looked up at me, confusion flickering across her face. What's wrong? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and opened the video files. Without saying a word, I turned the screen toward her. Her eyes widened as she recognized herself in the footage. Tears began streaming down her face almost instantly. Please, stop, she whispered, covering her mouth with trembling hands. But I didn't stop. I let the video play long enough for her to see everything: the men, their faces, her own blank expression as they took turns violating her dignity. When I finally paused it, the room fell silent except for her quiet sobs. Explain this, I demanded, my voice low and steady despite the storm raging inside me. I'm sorry, she choked out, unable to meet my gaze. I'm so sorry. That's not an explanation, I snapped. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you hide this? She shook her head, tears falling faster. I was scared. Scared of what? Of me finding out? Or scared of them? She didn't answer. Instead, she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. Watching her break down should have given me some satisfaction it was what I'd wanted. After all, but instead, it only deepened the emptiness inside me. After several minutes, I pressed further. How long has this been going on? A year, she admitted softly. It started a year ago, after work one night. Her words confirmed what I already knew, but hearing them aloud made it real in a way the footage never could. A year. An entire year of lies, secrets, and suffering, and I hadn't noticed a thing. And you thought keeping this from me was better than telling the truth? I asked bitterly. You chose secrecy over trust. That decision sealed your fate. Kathryn looked up at me, desperation in her eyes. I didn't want to lose you. I thought if I kept quiet, maybe it would go away. But it didn't go away, did it? I interrupted harshly. Instead, it got worse. You let them use you, manipulate you, and then you came home acting like nothing was wrong. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? I hoped you wouldn't, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Well, I did. And now we're done. With that, I handed her divorce papers. She stared at them, frozen, as if unable to comprehend what was happening. You can't mean this, she whispered, looking up at me. Oh, I do, I said firmly. Sign them, now. For a moment, she hesitated, her hands hovering over the documents. Then, with a shaky breath, she picked up the pen and began writing. Each stroke of the pen felt like a nail being hammered into the coffin of our marriage. Once she finished, I collected the papers and stood up. From now on, stay away from me in my house unless a lawyer says otherwise. Understood? She nodded weakly, still crying. Before leaving, I added one final blow. By the way, I found these in your room. I held up the bag containing the provocative lingerie and strange devices I'd discovered earlier. Care to explain? Her face flushed red, and she looked away, unable to respond. Thought so, I muttered. Goodbye, Kathryn. The boardroom was tense, the air thick with unspoken accusations. I sat at one end of the table, flanked by my lawyer, while Greg, Mark, Chris, and their company-appointed attorney occupied the other side. The polished surface of the conference table reflected the cold fluorescent lights above, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a courtroom than a corporate meeting. Greg looked different today, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous twitch in his jaw. Mark avoided eye contact entirely, staring down at his hands as if they held some invisible lifeline. Chris, the most junior of the trio, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing occasionally at Greg for reassurance. None of them spoke. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Finally, my lawyer cleared her throat and began. We're here to address serious allegations against Mr. Greg Thompson, Mr. Mark Sullivan, and Mr. Chris Reynolds regarding misconduct involving an employee under their supervision. Her voice was calm but firm, each word landing like a hammer blow. Greg's lawyer immediately interjected, attempting to downplay the situation. "These claims are exaggerated and lack substantial evidence," he said, his tone dismissive. But I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He knew we had something concrete, he just didn't know how much. I leaned forward slightly, placing the USB drive containing the footage onto the table. It landed with a soft click, drawing everyone's attention. "This contains irrefutable proof of your actions," I said, locking eyes with Greg. His face paled visibly, and even Mark flinched. My lawyer continued, laying out the case step by step. She described how Greg had used his position of authority to coerce Kathryn into submission, citing specific instances where he forced her to stay late under false pretenses. She outlined how Mark and Chris had been complicit, participating in and perpetuating the abuse over the course of a year. Every detail was backed up by timestamps, video clips, and corroborating statements from Kathryn herself. As the presentation unfolded, the reactions around the table grew increasingly desperate. Greg tried to interrupt, sputtering denials, but my lawyer cut him off sharply. "Save your excuses for the police," she snapped. "What you've done isn't just unethical, it's criminal." Mark finally broke his silence, stammering, "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We never meant to hurt anyone." "You didn't mean to hurt anyone?" I repeated incredulously, my voice rising. "You manipulated and abused a vulnerable woman for your own gratification. How can you possibly justify that?" Chris buried his face in his hands, muttering apologies under his breath. Meanwhile, Greg attempted to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Look," he said, leaning back in his chair, "maybe things got out of hand, but it's not like she resisted all that much after the first time." That comment ignited something inside me, a white-hot rage that burned away any semblance of restraint. Before I realized what I was doing, I stood up, slamming my palms against the table. "Are you seriously trying to blame her for your crimes? You violated her trust, her body, and her humanity." The tension in the room reached its peak as my lawyer laid out the final pieces of evidence. The USB drive containing the footage sat ominously on the table, a silent witness to the crimes committed. Greg's face was pale, his usual bravado replaced by a mixture of fear and desperation. Mark and Chris exchanged nervous glances, their earlier attempts at denial crumbling under the weight of irrefutable proof. My lawyer summarized our case one last time, emphasizing the gravity of their actions. "Your behavior constitutes not only professional misconduct but also criminal offenses," she stated firmly. "Coercion, abuse of power, and the exploitation of an employee are serious violations that will have severe consequences." Greg's lawyer tried to interject again, but his arguments were weak, almost pleading. If there was any misunderstanding, I cut him off sharply. "You filmed her. You blackmailed her. You destroyed her life. And now you're going to pay for it." At this point, Greg seemed to realize the futility of resistance. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. Mark buried his face in his hands while Chris stared blankly at the table, visibly shaken. It was clear they understood the game was over. Looking directly at Greg, I leaned forward, my voice cold and steady. "You abused your position, used it to manipulate and terrorize, and you dragged these two into your sick gang." I gestured toward Mark and Chris. Greg's face twitched. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I cut him off. "I've watched the footage. Every single video you used to blackmail her. Did you enjoy it, Greg? Did it make you feel powerful?" Chris finally found his voice, stammering, I didn't know it would go this far, we thought." "You thought what?" I snapped. That because she didn't fight back, it was okay? That makes you just as guilty. Mark chimed in, tears streaming down his face. We never meant to hurt anyone. Please, we'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Too late for apologies, I shot back. You had your chance when you first realized what you were doing was wrong. Instead, you chose to keep abusing her month after month. Now, it's my turn to decide your fate. With that, I turned to my lawyer, who proceeded to outline the terms of our demands. First, immediate resignation from their positions within the company. Second, full cooperation with any ongoing investigations, including providing statements against each other if necessary. Third, substantial financial restitution not just to Kathryn but to me as well, for the emotional and psychological damage inflicted. Greg's lawyer attempted to negotiate, suggesting lower figures for the compensation, but I refused to budge. This isn't negotiable, I said firmly. Either you agree to these terms or we take this public and let the courts decide. The threat worked. One by one, they caved. Greg signed the agreement first, his hand trembling as he scrawled his name across the document. Mark followed suit, barely able to hold the pen steady. Chris hesitated the longest, but eventually he too added his signature. Before leaving, I addressed them one final time. Remember this moment, I said quietly, because it's the beginning of the end for all of you. Whatever remnants of your lives remain, consider them forfeit. From now on, every decision you make, every action you take, will be haunted by what you've done here today. The days following the climactic showdown felt surreal. I had achieved everything I set out to do. Greg, Mark, and Chris were fired, their reputations in ruins. The company paid a hefty settlement, ensuring I'd never have to worry about finances again. Yet, despite the victories, an emptiness lingered within me. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring back what I had lost. Kathryn was gone, her life spiraling into chaos under the weight of guilt and despair. Her parents kept me updated on her condition. She barely ate, rarely spoke, and spent most of her time staring blankly at walls. They told me she still hoped for reconciliation, but I knew that would never happen. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt not after everything she had done. One evening, I returned to the Love Hotel parking area, where it all began. The manager greeted me warmly, clearly pleased with the new security camera I'd gifted him. Thanks again, he said, patting the device mounted near the entrance. This'll keep those troublemakers away. I nodded, though my visit wasn't just about checking up on him. Standing there amidst the quiet hum of nature, I reflected on how drastically my life had changed. A year ago, I was blissfully unaware of Kathryn's betrayal, living a normal if somewhat mundane existence. Now I was someone else entirely, colder, harder, more calculating. As I drove home, I thought about the men who had destroyed my marriage. Greg, Mark, and Chris weren't just victims of my vengeance, they were symbols of something larger. Their actions represented power abused, trust violated, and lives shattered. By dismantling them, I'd sent a message. No one could escape accountability for their sins. Still, as satisfying as it was to see them fall, I couldn't shake the feeling that revenge hadn't truly healed me. It had consumed me instead, turning my grief into anger and my pain into obsession. Was this who I wanted to become? A man defined by hatred and retribution? When I arrived home, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to grieve not just for my marriage, but for the person I used to be. Somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of who that man was. But perhaps it wasn't too late to find him again. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. While I couldn't undo the past, I could choose how to move forward. I decided to focus on rebuilding not my relationship with Kathryn, but myself. Over the weeks that followed, I threw myself into work, reconnecting with old hobbies, and even making plans to travel. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. In the end, I realized that true justice wasn't about destroying others, it was about reclaiming your own peace. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to start doing that.